The suitcase wheels barely crossed the threshold before I heard it. Laughter that made my stomach drop. Low, familiar in the way my husband's voice was familiar, but accompanied by something higher, feminine, intimate. I froze completely as I stepped into my own kitchen and saw a woman I'd never met before. She was wearing my robe. My burgundy robe that I'd left hanging in our master bathroom 3 weeks ago when I'd left for my mother's emergency surgery in Arizona. She was barefoot, leaning casually against the counter like she owned the place, holding a coffee mug I recognized as part of the set we'd received as a wedding gift. My husband Wesley didn't jump when he saw me, didn't stutter or look guilty or try to explain. He just exhaled slowly, a sound filled with annoyance rather than surprise, like I'd interrupted something important rather than walked into my own home unexpectedly. His eyes met mine with an expression that wasn't shame or panic, just irritation. "We need to talk," he said flatly. Those 4 words delivered with such casual confidence that my chest burned with the realization settling over me like ice water. This wasn't a one-time mistake I'd accidentally discovered. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment I'd walked in on. This had been happening long before tonight. Probably for weeks, maybe months. And he wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. My hands trembled where they gripped my suitcase handle, but I didn't scream. Every instinct told me to yell, to demand explanations, to throw something at the smug woman wearing my clothes in my kitchen. But I didn't. I nodded slowly while my heart cracked open inside my chest, the pain so sharp it felt physical. I heard my own voice say calmly, "I just got in from the airport. I'm exhausted from the flight. Can we talk tomorrow?" Even though my pulse was screaming at me to run, to fight, to do something other than stand there pretending to be reasonable. Wesley looked surprised by my calm response. The woman, whoever she was, looked almost disappointed that I wasn't providing the dramatic scene she'd probably expected. "Sure," Wesley said after a moment, clearly thrown off balance. "Tomorrow. That's fine." That silence, that unexpected calm, confused him. I could see it in his face. He'd prepared for tears, for accusations, for emotional breakdown. My quiet acceptance of delay wasn't in his script. And that confusion, I realized even in my shock, was becoming my shield. If he thought I was defeated, if he believed I'd accepted this situation passively, he'd be less careful about what came next, less guarded, more careless with evidence and planning. I turned and walked to the guest room without another word, closing the door behind me and finally allowing myself to shake. I'm Stephanie, the woman who'd helped buy this house 5 years ago, splitting the down payment equally with Wesley. I'd paid half the mortgage every month, half the utilities, half the property taxes. I'd put my career as a marketing consultant on hold 2 years ago when Wesley's aging father needed care, when he'd said, "We'll be fine on my salary for a while." I'd been the one who organized our finances meticulously, tracked every expense in shared spreadsheets, filed all our important documents in the home office cabinet. I'd signed mortgage papers, insurance forms, title documents, things Wesley barely glanced at before signing his name beside mine. Standing in that guest room, still hearing muffled conversation from the kitchen, I realized something chilling. Wesley thought I was disposable, thought I could be easily replaced and removed from the life we'd built together. He'd made that calculation because I was quiet in conflicts, because I avoided confrontation, because I'd always chosen peace over fighting. He'd mistaken my preference for calm as weakness, had confused my trust with naivety, had assumed that because I didn't demand constant reassurance or monitor his every move, I was someone who could be easily managed, deceived, and eventually discarded without serious consequence. He was about to learn how wrong that assumption was. The next evening, Wesley's parents came for dinner. He'd apparently planned this before I'd returned home early, and he didn't cancel. When I walked into the dining room, the woman from yesterday was there too, sitting at our table like she belonged. Wesley introduced her as Cassandra, someone going through a hard time who's staying with us temporarily. His family nodded along, their expressions suggesting they'd already been briefed on this situation. The glances they threw me said everything without words. I was the absent wife, the one who'd left to care for her own family instead of staying here. Problem. The reason things had fallen apart while I was gone. Wesley's mother actually patted Cassandra's hand sympathetically at one point, as if comforting someone who'd been wronged rather than someone who'd moved into another woman's home. I forced a smile so tight my jaw ached, sitting through that dinner while they discussed household matters like I was a guest instead of the co-owner of this house. Realizing that this betrayal wasn't just physical or emotional, it was reputational. Wesley had been telling stories about me, about our marriage, crafting a narrative that justified his actions and painted me as the villain, or at minimum as someone whose feelings no longer mattered. He'd done advance work to make his family accept this situation before I even knew it existed. The next morning, I started noticing details I'd been too shocked to see clearly the night I'd arrived. Small things throughout the house that were wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. Cabinets in the kitchen had been reorganized. Things weren't where I'd left them 3 weeks ago. Family photos that had hung in the hallway were missing, leaving nail holes and faded rectangles on the wall. My side of the bedroom closet had been thinned significantly. At least half my clothes were gone, packed away somewhere or maybe thrown out entirely. Books from my nightstand had disappeared. My favorite coffee mug was nowhere in the kitchen. The bathroom counter that had held my skincare products was cleared completely, replaced with unfamiliar bottles and brands. This wasn't just an affair that had happened impulsively while I was away. This was systematic removal of my presence from the house. An eviction in slow motion that had been happening deliberately, item by item, while I'd been in Arizona caring for my mother after her surgery. Wesley had been erasing me gradually, making room for Cassandra physically and emotionally, preparing for a transition he'd planned without my knowledge or consent. I slept in the guest room that night and started counting days instead of hours. Started planning instead of just reacting. Started understanding that I needed to protect myself legally and financially before this situation got worse. I overheard them talking late one evening when they thought I'd gone to bed. I was standing in the hallway, frozen outside the guest room door, listening to a conversation happening in the living room below. Wesley's voice carried clearly up the stairs. "She won't do anything. She never does. She'll probably just move back to Arizona quietly, and we can finalize everything without drama." Cassandra's voice responded, though I couldn't hear her words clearly. Then Wesley again. "Trust me. I know her. She avoids conflict like it's poison. Always has. That's why this will be easy." The certainty in his voice stung worse than discovering the affair itself. He'd calculated my response based on years of observing how I handled disagreement. Knew I preferred talking through problems quietly rather than making scenes. Had weaponized my personality traits against me, using my preference for peace as evidence that I wouldn't fight for myself or our marriage. He was right that I wouldn't confront him with screaming accusations or dramatic ultimatums. But he was completely wrong about what I would do instead. That's when I decided clearly and completely. I wouldn't confront Wesley about this betrayal in the ways he expected. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me break down or beg. I would simply outgrow him, plan him, prepare him, and let him discover too late that quiet didn't mean defeated. The following afternoon, while Wesley and Cassandra were out, doing errands together like a couple, which made my stomach turn, I went into our home office. The filing cabinet where we kept important documents was unlocked as always. Wesley had never been concerned about security inside our own home. I pulled out folders methodically. Mortgage documents showing both our names on the deed and loan. Property tax records listing us as co-owners. Insurance policies with both of us as named policyholders. Title documents from when we'd purchased the house. Signatures side by side. I also found some documents that made my blood run cold. Papers Wesley had printed recently, clearly from online legal template sites, attempting to establish sole ownership or create quitclaim deeds. None of them were completed or signed yet, but they showed intent. He was planning to remove me from ownership entirely somehow. I took photos of everything with my phone. slow and careful, making sure each image was clear and legible. My hands stayed steady for the first time in days. This was something concrete I could do. Evidence I could preserve. Protection I could establish. I'd spent years managing our household finances and paperwork while Wesley focused on his career. He'd always been grateful to let me handle boring administrative stuff. Now that meticulous organization was going to protect me from his attempt to erase my legal stake in everything we'd built together. I started playing the role Wesley had written for me. I acted small and defeated, made dinner without complaint, nodded when he and Cassandra discussed household decisions like I wasn't part of them, let his family talk around me at gatherings like I was already gone, already irrelevant. Every assumption they made about my weakness became leverage I was storing up. Every careless word got logged in a notes app on my phone when no one was looking. Every piece of evidence of how long this had been planned, how calculated his betrayal was, how completely they'd all decided to exclude and replace me. I played the part of the passive, accepting wife who was too timid to fight back. And they believed it completely because it aligned with their assumptions about who I was. Wesley visibly relaxed as days passed without dramatic confrontation. Started acting more openly affectionate with Cassandra in front of me, like testing boundaries to see if I'd react. When I didn't, when I just quietly left the room or focused on something else, he grew even more confident in his control of this situation. His family stopped watching me carefully at gatherings, stopped being guarded in their conversations. They'd decided I was harmless, not a threat, someone who would fade away quietly when pushed. Every single one of those underestimations was a gift. Every time they forgot I was observant and intelligent was an opportunity to gather more evidence while they weren't being careful around me. Cassandra grew increasingly comfortable as weeks passed. She started calling it our house when talking to friends on the phone, conversations I could hear from other rooms. She hosted her own friends for coffee in my kitchen, in my home, without any apparent sense of how inappropriate that was. She talked excitedly about repainting the bedroom, about changing the living room furniture, about finally making this space feel like me. I watched her plan a future built on paperwork she'd clearly never seen. Watched her assume ownership of a house she had no legal claim to whatsoever. And I didn't correct her. Didn't inform her that both the deed and the mortgage had my name on them just as prominently as Wesley's. Didn't mention that major decisions about this property required both signatures, not just his. I let her believe that comfort equaled permanence. Let her settle in emotionally and practically. Let her invest herself in a future that existed only in Wesley's promises rather than legal reality. Because her confidence, like his, would make the eventual truth harder to accept. The deeper they both sank into their illusion of how this would unfold, the more devastating it would be when that illusion shattered against the facts of property ownership and my refusal to simply disappear. I quietly consulted a professional. No drama, no threats, no emotional explanations. Just made an appointment with a family law attorney whose name I'd found through careful online research. I brought my documentation. Photos of property records, mortgage papers, title documents, evidence of equal financial contribution to the household. The attorney listened to my entire story without judgment or surprise. Apparently situations like mine weren't uncommon. "You're in a strong legal position," she explained calmly. "Both your names on the deed means he can't remove you or make major decisions about the property without your consent. His attempt to move someone else in doesn't change your ownership rights." She outlined exactly what my signature protected. What actions Wesley couldn't take legally without my agreement. What assumptions he'd apparently made that were going to cost him dearly when reality caught up to his planning. For the first time since I'd walked into that kitchen and seen Cassandra wearing my robe, I felt something other than pain and shock. I felt protected, informed, prepared. That night, I slept through the night for the first time in weeks. Not because the situation had improved, but because I finally understood exactly where I stood legally and what I needed to do to protect myself. Knowledge was power. And I finally had knowledge to match Wesley's apparent confidence. At a family gathering the following weekend, Wesley's sister Felicity cornered me in the kitchen while I was refilling drinks. "You really should move on," she said, her voice carrying smug satisfaction. "Wesley's clearly happy now. Fighting this would just be bitter and vindictive. You should let him go gracefully." I looked around the room from where I stood, memorizing faces. Wesley's parents, his siblings, his aunt and uncle. All of them had apparently decided I was the obstacle to their son's happiness. None of them had asked for my side of the story. None had questioned why Cassandra was living in our house or how that arrangement had come about. They just accepted Wesley's narrative completely. That was fine. I'd learned that arguing with people who'd already decided you were wrong was pointless. They'd chosen their side based on information Wesley had provided. Information that was incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst. They'd get the full story eventually. Just not from me trying to convince them while they were actively hostile. They'd get it through legal documents and property records, and the eventual realization that their confident son had made assumptions about control he didn't actually have. Unfiltered truth had a way of traveling once it started moving. I just needed to make sure I had all my documentation organized and protected before setting that truth in motion. Wesley rushed paperwork during this period in ways that concerned me deeply. He brought home documents for me to sign, explaining them vaguely as just updating our records or standard property maintenance stuff. He wanted me to sign quickly, casually, without reading carefully. He was trying to lock me out emotionally and financially in one coordinated move, using my trust and my preference for avoiding lengthy discussions to slip things past me that would remove my legal protections. But I'd already consulted an attorney, already understood what he was attempting, so I didn't sign anything. I'd smile and say, "Let me read through this first," then never bring it up again. When he'd ask about documents he'd given me days ago, I'd claim I'd misplaced them or hadn't had time to review them carefully yet. His frustration grew visibly. But he couldn't force me to sign without revealing his hand too obviously. Couldn't push too hard without making me suspicious if he still believed I was ignorant about his larger plans. What Wesley didn't realize was that rushing left fingerprints. His attempt to speed through paperwork before I had time to question anything created a documented pattern of him trying to make unilateral decisions about jointly owned property. Every refused signature, every document I lost, every time I delayed his timeline, all of it was evidence I was quietly preserving. Evidence that would matter if this eventually ended up in legal proceedings about property division and his attempt to remove me from ownership through manipulation. Fear faded into clarity as time passed. The initial shock and pain transformed into something colder and more focused. I packed a bag with essential documents, copies of property records, financial statements, insurance policies, my attorney's contact information. Not because I was leaving, but because I wanted to be ready for any scenario. I stopped reacting emotionally to Wesley and Cassandra's behavior in the house. Stopped letting it wound me every time I saw them acting like a couple in spaces I'd helped create. Started observing their patterns instead. When they left the house. What they discussed when they thought I wasn't listening. How confident they'd become in their assumption that I was defeated. Wesley clearly mistook my calm for acceptance. My lack of dramatic confrontation for defeat. He'd relax when I was in the room now. Sometimes even discussing future plans in front of me like I was furniture instead of a person with legal rights and emotional investment in our shared property. That casual dismissal of my presence was perhaps the clearest indication of how completely he'd underestimated me. He'd decided I was irrelevant to his future plans. That decision was going to be his biggest mistake. Because irrelevant people didn't fight back. But people who'd been underestimated while maintaining strength. They were dangerous in ways that confident people never anticipated. Cassandra started asking Wesley questions I could overhear from adjacent rooms. Why was my name still on so many documents? When would the property transfer be finalized? Why were things taking so long to make their situation official and permanent? Wesley's answers grew increasingly irritated. He'd snap at her in ways he hadn't before, the stress of his stalling strategy creating tension in their relationship. "It's complicated," he'd say sharply. "These things take time. Stop pushing me about it." I could hear the cracks forming in their illusion. The fantasy they'd built about seamlessly transitioning from my marriage to their relationship was confronting the reality that legal processes don't care about emotional narratives. That property ownership has rules and requirements they'd ignored while planning their future. Cassandra's growing suspicion that something wasn't as simple as Wesley had promised created friction between them that was obvious even to me from the guest room where I'd been staying. Their fights became more frequent. Harsh whispers late at night about why nothing was progressing the way he'd said it would. The situation I'd said nothing about, the evidence I'd gathered while remaining silent, it was creating more pressure on their relationship than any confrontation from me could have achieved. Silence was louder than tears would have been when people expected emotional breakdown and got strategic calm instead. Wesley called a family meeting 6 weeks after I'd come home. His entire family gathered in our living room. His parents, siblings, aunt and uncle, all of them sitting like this was an intervention designed to make me see reason. "We need to clear the air," Wesley announced, standing near the fireplace like he was presenting a case. "Talk honestly about where things stand." He spent 20 minutes spinning a story about our marriage growing apart gradually, about me becoming distant and focused on my family in Arizona, about feeling abandoned and finding connection with Cassandra during a difficult time, about wanting to move forward amicably without making things ugly or complicated. The narrative was polished, practiced, made him sound like someone who'd been hurt and was trying to do the right thing despite difficult circumstances. Made me sound like someone who'd checked out of our marriage emotionally long before he'd sought comfort elsewhere. When he finished, all eyes turned to me. They expected tears or angry accusations or defensive explanations. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder I'd organized carefully. "I brought copies," I said quietly, sliding the folder onto the coffee table. "Since we're talking about honesty, I thought everyone should see the full timeline of events." The room went very still. Pages shuffled as Wesley's family started reviewing documents I'd organized chronologically. Property records showing when we'd purchased the house. 5 years ago, both names on the deed. Mortgage statements showing equal payments from joint accounts over those 5 years. Text messages from Wesley 3 months ago, before I'd left for Arizona, discussing with someone whose number I didn't recognize how to handle the house situation. Photos I'd taken of the documents he'd printed from legal template sites, attempting to create quitclaim deeds to remove me from ownership. Bank statements showing purchases of women's clothing and personal items charged to our joint credit card while I'd been in Arizona, items now clearly belonging to Cassandra. The timeline was undeniable once everything was arranged sequentially. This hadn't been a spontaneous connection during a difficult time. This had been planned systematically. The affair had started before I'd left for Arizona, not during my absence as Wesley had implied. His attempts to remove me from property ownership had been underway for months. The house he'd told Cassandra would be theirs was legally half mine with no legitimate path for him to change that without my signature. Faces changed as they processed information that contradicted Wesley's careful narrative. His mother's expression went from sympathy for her son to confusion to something like horror. His father was reading mortgage documents with growing tension in his jaw. Felicity, who'd told me to move on gracefully, had gone pale. Cassandra stood abruptly, her face drained of color. She'd been sitting on the couch looking confident and comfortable, Wesley's partner in this meeting. Now she clutched her bag to her chest like a shield, staring at the documents spread across the coffee table. She finally understood what I'd known for weeks. She hadn't moved into Wesley's house where she'd be safe and welcome. She'd moved into a legal battlefield, into property that was jointly owned by a wife who hadn't agreed to dissolve the marriage or give up her claim to assets she'd equally invested in, into a situation that wasn't the clean transition Wesley had apparently promised her. "You said this was handled," Cassandra said to Wesley, her voice shaking. "You said the house was yours, that everything was already separated." that she'd agreed. "I told you it was in process," Wesley replied defensively. "These things take time." "You lied," Cassandra interrupted. "You've been lying about everything." She looked around the room at Wesley's family, then at me with something like apology or maybe just fear in her expression. Then she left, walked out of the living room, out of the house, without saying goodbye to anyone. Her car started in the driveway moments later. Wesley didn't follow her, just stood frozen by the fireplace, his carefully constructed situation collapsing around him while his family stared at him with expressions ranging from shock to anger to profound disappointment. Wesley tried damage control immediately after Cassandra left. He attempted apologizing, saying he'd made mistakes but we could work through them together. When apology didn't create the response he wanted, he switched to blaming me for being too focused on my family in Arizona, for not being present enough emotionally, for creating distance that pushed him toward seeking connection elsewhere. When blame didn't work, he tried begging, saying he loved me, that he'd been confused, that he wanted to rebuild our marriage and forget everything that had happened. Each version of his explanation sounded weaker than the last, more desperate, more obviously crafted to achieve specific effects rather than expressing genuine emotion or remorse. I didn't raise my voice through any of it, didn't yell accusations or call him names or break down crying. I just listened quietly while he cycled through every manipulation technique he could think of, watching each one fail to move me. His family watched too, saw him try multiple contradictory explanations in the span of 30 minutes, saw him shift blame, then accept responsibility, then shift blame again depending on what seemed to be working in the moment. They were seeing what I'd been seeing for weeks. Someone who was calculating responses based on what would benefit him rather than speaking from genuine truth or remorse. The distance between his words and sincerity was becoming obvious to everyone in that room. Consequences multiplied over the following weeks. I didn't gossip about what had happened, didn't post about it on social media or tell elaborate stories to mutual friends. But paperwork traveled on its own. Legal documentation had a way of making truth visible without requiring me to explain or defend anything. Wesley's family stopped calling him for their regular check-ins. His parents canceled their weekly dinners that had been tradition for years. His siblings stopped inviting him to casual gatherings. They'd realized they'd been defending someone who'd lied systematically, not just to me but to them, had used their support as cover while doing things they'd never have condoned if they'd known the full truth. Friends we'd had as a couple started choosing sides. Most of them chose mine once they learned I hadn't abandoned the marriage or created distance that justified Wesley's behavior, that he'd been planning his exit while I was caring for my mother after surgery, that the story he'd been telling was selectively edited to make himself sympathetic. Wesley started sleeping on the couch in the living room. He couldn't go to the master bedroom where Cassandra had stayed briefly, couldn't go to the guest room where I was sleeping, couldn't leave the house because legally it was half his and he had nowhere else to go. He was trapped by the same property ownership he'd tried to use to trap me, confined to a home that had become uncomfortable because he'd destroyed trust he couldn't rebuild. I filed legal documents through my attorney. Everything was carefully calculated to be exactly what I was entitled to under law. Nothing more, nothing less. Division of jointly owned property. Dissolution of marriage. Fair distribution of assets we'd accumulated together. The paperwork was factual, unemotional, precise. It asked for what I'd contributed to be recognized and protected, what I'd invested in our marriage and home to be returned. No punitive damages, no attempts to take more than my share, just fairness. But fairness hurt people who'd been relying on imbalance, people who'd expected to control outcomes through manipulation rather than legal process. Wesley had operated under the assumption that he could remove me from property and assets I'd helped build without my consent or fair compensation. The legal system didn't care about his assumptions, only about documented ownership and contribution. He tried fighting the filing initially, hired an attorney who reviewed the documentation and apparently told him exactly what my attorney had told me. His position was weak. He couldn't claim sole ownership of jointly held property. Couldn't prove I'd abandoned our marriage when I'd been caring for family with his knowledge and original support. Eventually, Wesley signed the dissolution papers. Not because he wanted to, but because he had no other choice that wouldn't cost him significantly more in legal fees and time while achieving the same outcome. Sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply insist on fairness when someone expected you to accept less. Wesley packed boxes under my supervision. The attorney had advised this, that neither of us should be alone in the house removing items until property division was finalized. So I watched him box up his clothes, his books, his personal items. There was no yelling, no dramatic scenes or thrown objects. Just the quiet humiliation of him realizing he'd miscalculated everything about who I was and what I'd do. He'd thought I was weak because I preferred peace. Thought I was naive because I'd trusted him. Thought I'd simply disappear when pushed because I avoided confrontation. Every assumption had been wrong. And now he was packing boxes in the house he'd tried to steal from me while I watched calmly, knowing that when he left, this space would be entirely mine. Everything he was removing was his to take. But everything we'd built together, the house, the equity, the shared investments, that would be divided according to law rather than his preferences. He'd made his choices. Now he was living with consequences he hadn't anticipated. The woman he'd tried to erase from his life and property was the one standing there watching him leave with only what he'd come with. Poetic justice didn't require my anger or tears. Just required I refuse to accept the role he'd written for me. Required I insist on truth and fairness when he'd expected silence and submission. After Wesley left, I started reclaiming the space that had been ours but would now be only mine. I repainted the bedroom. No longer the color he'd preferred but the soft blue I'd always wanted. Moved furniture back to arrangements that made sense to me rather than compromises we'd made. Hung my photos again in the hallway where they belonged, filling the nail holes that had been empty for too long. The house exhaled with me, like it had been holding its breath during those tense weeks of conflict, and was finally able to relax. For the first time since I'd returned from Arizona and discovered Cassandra in my kitchen, this space felt like mine. Not ours. Not contested. Just peacefully, securely mine. I bought new sheets for the bed. New dishes to replace ones that carried too many uncomfortable memories. Threw out the coffee mug Cassandra had been using that first night. I'd never be able to look at it without remembering that moment of shock and betrayal. Each small change helped. Made the house feel less like a place I'd been pushed out of and more like a home I'd chosen to reclaim. I planted new flowers in the front yard. Rearranged the kitchen to suit my cooking habits instead of compromising for Wesley's preferences. Bought artwork I'd always loved but he'd said didn't match our style. Every change was mine alone. No consultation or compromise required. Wesley sent a message 6 months after he'd moved out. I saw his name appear on my phone screen and briefly considered not opening it. But curiosity won. "We could have fixed this," the message read. "If you'd just talked to me instead of going straight to legal action. We could have worked things out." I stared at those words for a long moment. The rewriting of history they represented. The audacity of suggesting I'd been the one who'd avoided communication when he'd moved another woman into our house while I was caring for my mother. When he'd systematically tried to remove me from property ownership. When he'd told his family lies to make them complicit in his betrayal. I didn't reply. Closure wasn't a conversation where I explained his errors or defended my choices one more time. Closure was a decision. My decision that this chapter of my life was finished. That Wesley's understanding or approval wasn't required for me to move forward. That his attempt to rewrite our ending into something where I was partially responsible for problems he'd created didn't deserve acknowledgement. I deleted the message. Blocked his number. He'd had countless opportunities to talk, to be honest, to treat our marriage with respect. He'd chosen deception and betrayal instead. Now he lived with consequences while I lived with peace. That was closure enough. Truth didn't require his agreement to be truth. My moving forward didn't require his permission or understanding. I rebuilt steadily over the year following our separation. Returned to my marketing consulting career with renewed focus and energy. The time I'd spent caring for Wesley's father, managing our household while he worked, dealing with the chaos of discovering his betrayal, all of that had been exhausting in ways I hadn't fully recognized until the weight lifted. Now, working for myself again, I remembered why I'd loved this career. The creativity, the problem-solving, the satisfaction of helping clients achieve their goals. My business grew quickly. Referrals from satisfied clients led to more projects than I could handle alone. I hired an assistant, then a second one. Expanded my services beyond what I'd offered before taking time away. Confidence followed professional success. I started accepting social invitations I'd declined during the difficult months. Reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with. Joined a yoga studio. Took a painting class at the community center. Built a life that was mine alone, shaped by my preferences and choices without compromise or accommodation of someone else's needs. People who'd watched me go through the separation asked how I'd stayed so calm through everything. How I'd handled betrayal and legal battles without breaking down publicly. I told them the truth. Clarity is louder than anger. Truth documented is more powerful than emotion without evidence. And sometimes the strongest thing you could do was refuse to accept the role someone else tried to force you into. I locked the door behind me as I left for a vacation I'd planned by myself. My first solo trip in over a decade. Not out of loss but out of choice. Out of excitement for possibility rather than fear of solitude. I didn't destroy Wesley through revenge or public humiliation. I simply let his actions stand in clear light. Let evidence speak for itself. Let truth travel on paperwork and documentation rather than emotional accusations. Refuse to accept the narrative he'd tried to create about weak wife who'd be easily managed and removed. As I walked toward my car with a suitcase packed for adventure instead of family emergency, I understood something profound. Silence hadn't made me weak during those difficult weeks. It had made me unstoppable. Because while everyone assumed my quiet meant defeat, I'd been gathering evidence, consulting professionals, and preparing strategies they never anticipated. I'd let them underestimate me completely while protecting myself thoroughly. Wesley had tried to write me out of the story of our shared life. Had attempted to erase me from property, from family connections, from the future he'd planned. But stories required consent from all their characters. And I'd simply refused to accept the ending he'd planned. Had written my own instead. One where truth, documentation, and strategic patience proved more powerful than manipulation and assumptions. Where the woman everyone thought would disappear quietly became impossible to ignore. I drove away from the house that was fully mine now, toward a future I'd built myself, knowing this truth completely. The most powerful response to betrayal isn't always noise and confrontation. Sometimes it's documented truth presented calmly at exactly the right moment. And walking away not because you're running but because you're choosing yourself.